Got it. We are indeed recording. So the time is, I think we have another minute or so to go, correct?
Yes.
Who's keeping time?
Right.
I have to say, last time, Michael Gillis said that a certain verse from the prophet was in the Haftarah of Toldot, and he was right, and I went for the wrong source, the same prophet, but a different chapter. So Michael was right. It's always good to say that somebody else was right. And I'm happy
Anyone
to
can make a mistake, Rabbi.
I'm happy to do so in public. So Michael, keep on keeping me on the straight and the narrow in terms of biblical passages and sources. Okay, I think we're getting to all the people who have been attending up until now. Val, how are you? You're muted. Okay. So I think I'm just going to begin. I think it is time. I'm going to put on the share screen. And here we are. Now, I think just a couple of minutes, because we had a break, to come up to speed. For Maimonides, absolute rejection of anything physical in relation to God. So much so that if you believe that God has any physicality at all, any corporeality, you are worse than an old-fashioned idol worshiper. Now, that was quite a dramatic statement. And of course, it means that idolatry is with us, and it may be more serious and more profound a sin today than it was thousands of years ago. Imagine that, very powerful idea. Now, Raavad, an older contemporary of Maimonides, was a little upset. And he said, well, there are better people and greater people than Maimonides who did believe that God has some physicality. And so he's put off by the strength of Maimonides' condemnation of those who are believers in corporeality. But in any case, we'll also refer to a Kabbalistic book that is attributed to the 3rd century Eretz Israel called Shiur Koma. It's a short book belonging to what we call the Hechalot and the Merkava literature, which was the mysticism of early Eretz Israel. As I said, this is 3rd century. And we read statements attributed to Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva in this work. But it is Shiur Koma. It gives you the details of God's body. Now, it is absolutely unbelievable. We'll say a little more about it soon. It is a body, but of course, very different to ours. Is it so terrible to believe in such a thing? Well, the Rambam says it is. Now, what Rambam does, and this is in the first 49 chapters of Guide for the Perplexed, is to go through each and every word in the Tanakh that might give you an impression that God has a physical aspect, and shows you that linguistically speaking, this is not true. And if you can understand what Hebrew words in the Bible mean properly, you will never fall into the trap of attributing physicality to God. Now, of course, Rambam, as he said to us in his introduction, is not originating this. It is found in the first Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Tanakh, of the Torah, rather, by Onkelos, who, according to the Midrashic tradition, was a member of the family of Hadrian. And there's this famous Midrash about Hadrian tried to send his soldiers to bring Onkelos back to Rome. And each time, Onkelos convinced the soldiers that Judaism was the best thing, and therefore he never actually was taken by Hadrian soldiers back to Rome. In any case, Onkelos consistently reads, and we're going to see one example very soon, which is very dramatic, reads the Bible in such a way that God is never corporeal. And Maimonides says, I'm continuing along with that. But of course, in religious terms, the idea of interpreting a word, and we learned the 3 canons of interpretation. homonyms, metaphors, or amphibolous words. We do all the time. But for example, I'm in a Friday night davening, we'll say, Naharotim Chauchof from Psalms 98. What does that mean, Naharotim Chauchof? Somebody translate it into English, or Chaf, I should say.
The rivers clap their hands.
The rivers clap their hands. And when we read that pasuk, when you're going to read it on this coming Friday night, are you imagining rivers clapping hands?
No.
No.
Not really. Nobody's seen a river that claps hands. Correct, John? Jonah? We've never seen a river clapping hands. We understand that a literary work will use the phrase to say the rivers exude joy. Somehow we get a feeling of joy. Okay, the same with all the trees of the field are going to be clapping their hands. I mean, you know, we could go a la Tolkien and imagine trees, or even Shakespeare, Burnham Wood, okay, Michael, this is for the Scots among stuff, advancing, but we don't really believe that, and we interpret the Tanakh. Or if it says, "V'lo taki etchem haaretz," the earth will not vomit you up. Do we really believe that the earth has a gut somewhere, and there's a movement, a peristalsis-like movement, and suddenly things come up from the earth? Of course not. We understand what it means, that you will not be tolerated. Or even a phrase like umaltem et orlat levavchem, umal Hashem et orlat levavchem. How do you understand that the Lord will circumcise the foreskins of your heart? Is it open heart surgery that we're going to have to do? Of course not. It is a spiritual idea. But the problem is that when it comes to God, we don't know God like we know rivers and forests and trees and human hearts, or even the bowels of the earth. And how are we to judge how to think about God if not what it says in the Torah? So we're much more scared. And it was Rambam who basically told us, don't worry, the same tools you apply to regular interpretation of the Tanakh, you apply to those bits of Tanakh that refer to God. Now, it's not difficult to do it like we did last week with the Rambam in relation to the phrase that God said, or diber, amar. We show that amar in Hebrew of the Bible, can mean to intend, that amar can mean to desire, to do something, halahorgenia ta'omer, or vayomer esav bilibo, okay? No organs of speech. But we got a tough nut to crack, and the first chapter of the Guide of the Perplexed deals with two phrases that are indeed somewhat difficult, because the first pasuk that really presents us with a problem is the pasuk in Bereshit Na'aseh Adam B'Tzalmeinu Kidmutenu. Now that's translated as let us make man in our image after our likeness. That means God and man have something similar. And Rabbi Moshe Taku, remember, cited a midrash of Chazal. Why do we cut down an executed criminal who's put up on a tree to hang after his capital punishment? Because people will pass by and say, look, there's God hanging there. So Rambam's first chapter is devoted to Tselem Udumus. Let's read it together. Line 3. Kvar chashvu bnei Adam. People have thought, ki tselem balashon ha'ivri yoreh al tmunat hadavar v'toaro. Tselem, unusual word, means tmuna, a shape, or a toar. Toar is the configuration. If we take a face, the face has a general shape, there's a general impression. Then you have the eyes and the ears and the nose and the mouth. You could say nice things about someone's mouth. Ve'inei le'a rakot. But we don't know about the rest of Leah, okay? Let's not go there, okay? But clearly there is a toar and there is a mar'eh, or a tmuna. People saw this, Rambam's age. Certainly they said, God has a physical form. We look like him. לא אומרו, נעשה אדם בצלמנו כדמותנו. וחשבו שהשם על צורת אדם רצה לומר תמונתו ותארו. God looks like man or humankind in general shape, and also the particular organs. והתחייבה להם הגשמה גמורה. And therefore they really went the whole hog with corporeality. והאמינו בה, and they believed in it. וראו שהם אם יפרדו מזאת האמונה יחזיבו הכתוב. And if they do not believe that God has a bodily form, they will be basically going against what's written in the Torah. וגם ישימו השם נהדר, and God will no longer exist. We will rule him out of existence. אם לא יהיה בעל פנים ביד כמותם בתמונה ותואר, unless he has these organs. אלא שהוא יותר גדול ויותר בהיר לפי סברתם. What does it mean? He's bigger and he's better. החומר שלו גם אינו דם ובשר. He's a bionic God, if I can use that term. Okay? Not flesh and blood, but something much, much better than that. זה תכלית מה שחשבו רוממות בחוק השם. They thought that if we want to make God great, this is what we have to believe. אמנם מה שצריך שיאמר בהרחקת הגשמות. The theory that we have to keep corporeality as far away as possible, והעמיד האחדות האמיתית, and to have an understanding of God's unity, which is true, and can only be true if there's no corporeality, because nothing truly no true unity can be physical, because everything physical is divisible. הנה תדע מופת על כל זה בזה המאמר. You will learn the truth of what we're going to say in this מאמר, means this treatise, Moreh Nevukhim. אבל הראתנו בזה הפרק הוא לבאר עניין צלם ודמות. But all we're doing now, this chapter, talk about צלם and דמות. And here we see Rambam's philological approach so clearly. ואומר, כי הצורה המפורסמת אצל ההמון, אשר היא תמונת הדבר ותארו. Know and understand that the meaning in Hebrew of that, if you want to give a Hebrew word for shape, physical form, or its configuration, Shema Yuchad Ba Belashon Ivrit Toar. We have to use the word Toar. Amar, Yifei Toar Vifei Mareh. What do we say about whom? Who was Yifei Toar Vifei Mareh?
Yosef.
Yosef. Now, Yifei Toar means his general shape was great, and Yifei Mareh, Toar, his bits and pieces were great. We shan't elaborate. Vifei Mareh, and his general appearance was absolutely beautiful. Okay, the women couldn't take their eyes off him. They cut their hands as they were peeling vegetables. They bled because they couldn't take their eyes off Yosef, who was bringing, I guess, the groceries to the kitchen. Ma ta'oro, said who to whom?
Shaul. Shaul.
Debbie says Shaul.
It's about Shaul.
Shaul. To the
No,
witch
it's
of
not
Endor.
about Shaul. Shaul says to the witch of Endor, I want you to raise Samuel before my last battle. So he says, Ma ta'oro. She shrieks because she sees, actually this time, the witchcraft seems to have worked. There's an old man with a robe. So Shaul says, what does he look like? What's his appearance? And she says, Zaken or Tef Me'il. And then Shaul bows down because he says, this is Shmuel. Ketoar b'nei hamelech. Where's that? About whom, or whose sons? That's a hint. Gideon's sons. And there were two bad guys called Zebach and Salmona. They killed the sons of Gideon. And when the news was brought to Gideon, he said, who did they kill? The people who have the appearance, have kingly appearance. They knew it was his sons. The Ne'emar b'tzura hamalachiyit. What's tzura malachiyit? Relation to objects, not only to people. Yeshayahu talks about making idols. How do you make idols? Yita'arehu vasered. First of all, you cut out the material and you do it with a linear object, say a ruler. Uvemechuga yita'arehu. What would that mean? And a compass, a round object. You also cut out shapes. And Toar, we make the shape. V'zeu shem shelo yipol al Hashem yitbarach klal chalil v'kas. You wouldn't apply this to God. It's only people or materials. Omnam selem hu nofel ala tzura tivit. Now selem applies to the natural form. Now here, of course, I'm not going to burden you through these shiurim with too much Aristotle, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Baya, etc., etc., etc. Okay, the Aristotelians and the Arabic commentators. Just one word. Everything according to the theory which Rambam accepted as being the best intellectual theory of his time, everything is defined according to its end. We all get to an end which is our perfection. A chair has a perfect end. There's a perfect chair. A dog has a perfect end, a perfect chair. Plato and Aristotle had a machloket as to whether there's somewhere out there the perfect chair, or whether chairs always have to come with a physical form, but that physical form is complemented by the absolute idea of chairness. So this is something, a taste of the intellectual belief of the time, shared by smart, clever, cultured people, okay, which Rambam certainly felt he was one of. And therefore he says that when we talk about Tselem, of God, we're talking about the ultimate perfection in God that we can possibly grasp or understand. It makes it the most perfect form of what it is. And the absolute ultimate truth of that existing thing. Now, when it comes to Adam, it is intellectual comprehension. This is what makes humankind its most perfect form. No mistaking here. Aristotle, right through Maimonides, and to philosophers today. What marks us off from anything else in the universe is our capacity for intellectualism. Okay? So therefore, when we use Tselem, we're saying that Tselem, the Tselem Elohim, is that part of Elohim which we find as the most perfect expression of humanness. And because only humans have that capacity for absolute intellectual apprehension, or if you like, even intellectual power, the bit of God that gives us our Tselem Elohim is the intellectual capacity. Now, Rambam, of course, will give you everything in the Tanakh that he can find. Salmam tivzeh, when the Psalm is talking about bad people, what is God's attitude to bad people? Salmam tivzeh, he despises their tselem. Now, does tselem mean he despises their body, or he doesn't like the shape of their nose, it's too long? Of course not. He doesn't like the way they think, the way they act, their whole humanness. It's their personality and their character. And remember, human intellectualism for Rambam has two things. One, it has moral perfection, and two, intellectual perfection. Aristotle, Havdil Elef Havdalot, said the same thing. You cannot be a true intellectual without being a perfectly ethical person. This was a fundamental Aristotelian belief shared by many other Greek philosophers as well. So therefore, Salmam Tivzeh is a good proof that Tselem, which is a very rare word, doesn't mean a physical shape. Now, the min is the general species. The form of the species, in other words, what makes humankind as a species special, what gives it its special form, special nature, is combination of intellectual and moral perfection. Not the way our limbs are put together, the way we look. What do we call an idol in Yiddish? Was is an idol? Atzelem. Was is Atzelem? Now, Rambam says, Slamim. Remember what he said last week. Rambam has a very clear idea of idolatry. Idolatry is where you need an image to get to a god. The image itself, the wood, the silver, and the gold, is merely some type of representation to help you get to the truth, okay, what lies behind. So therefore, Tselem fits well with an idol. An idol is only a way of representing the God that is way beyond the idol. Of course, that's how he explains the golden calf. That's how he explains the fact that ancient idolatry wasn't such a bad thing. And remember, that's where we read about the psukim that Michael and I had a little argument about, okay? So all this fits in very nicely. However, Rambam is intellectually honest. We do find one other reference in Tanakh to Tselem. V'chen omro, I'm in line 18, Salmei Techorechem. What are Salmei Techorechem? What is the context? Book of Samuel. Hello? Michael.
Something to do with, it's normally, Tchoreim is normally translated as hemorrhoids, or whatever that means.
Yeah, well, hemorrhoids, we know what that means, Michael. It's a nasty disease in your backside. Emerods is what you wanted to say. E-M-E-R-O-D-S. That's the
Emerods.
translation. Now,
Emerods
emerods was a 16th and 17th century word, which included hemorrhoids, but it's any sort of round pustule on your body that's disgusting. Could be bubonic plague, it could be boils, could be tumors, okay? The pustules of plague, emerods. Now, what happened? What context do we have emerods? Book of Samuel, chapter, close to the beginning. What happened? Eli was in Shiloh, Shiloh fell, and who grabbed the Aron HaKodesh? Which group?
Plishtim.
The Plishtim. And what happened to the Plishtim? God made them suffer.
Oh,
they
yes.
got emerods. So what did they do? They said, we figured out that the emerods are because we captured the Jewish ark. So what should we do? Give back the ark. But we're going to have to give a present. So what did they do? Cutely, the Samnei Plishtim said, let's make some gold emerods, little bumpy things, place them on the ark. They're made of gold. They're quite valuable. They show that we're sorry for, and we realize that we were punished by God. You can read the chapter and make of it what you want. But there, it seems very likely. Well, it could go either way. This could be an amphibulous word. Remember amphibulous words, okay? Could go either way in Greek. Now, you could say that what the Philistines thought, being classical idolaters, was that they would transfer the actual disease onto these golden emerods, and if they sent them out of Philistia, they would go back to the God who sent them. So it's again a bit like the Shelem. But at the same time, you might have this feeling that the word Selem there really describes these rounded objects. So he says, "V'im efshami bilti yotzalmeita chorechem utzlamim nikraim ken mipnei hatmuna v'hatoar." Now, if you can quite rightly say to me, look, I think that the word there is definitely used to describe these little round physical golden objects. So what you say is that yem ken selem she mishtatef or mistapek. It's either a homonym or it's amphibulous. We don't know. It depends upon the context. Remember, John saw a man on the mountain with a telescope and all that. Yomar al-surah haminit, val-surah hamalachiyit. It can be both. It can refer to the form, the highest form of anything, or it can refer sometimes to what it looks like. And you could say that about the rest of the corporeal descriptions of God. They're amphibulous or they're homonyms. So what the Rambam is saying here, Maimonides is saying, I think I've given you enough evidence to show you that at least this is an amphibulous word. And because it is amphibulous, I can look at everything in my world that I believe to be good and interpret it that way. Okay? So I've done my job in relation to Tselem. Now I want to tackle the Demutenu. Dimion, okay, Demut, who shemin dama, to be similar to 23. Vugamken dimion beinyan. But that's clearly a metaphor. Komro, dimiti likat midbar. In the book of Psalms, The psalmist says, I mourned like a pelican in the wilderness. Now, I don't know whether pelicans do a lot of mourning, okay? With a U, I don't know whether they live in the wilderness. But that's the general translation of cut. And there we are. It's like tachash, seal skins in the Sinai desert. We're not talking about I've got feathers and I've got wings, okay? The mourning, the sadness of the pelican is like my sadness. I'm expressing my feeling. The most beautiful tree in God's garden, the book of Ezekiel. What is Ezekiel referring to? Ashur, Assyria, was at the height of its power, the most beautiful empire in the world. So it's compared to a tree in God's garden. Not that Ashur is a tree. Dimyon be'inyana yofi, but it's beautiful. There's a song, is there not, about a tree, a poem as a tree. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as the tree, a tree that, etc. Okay, but God can make trees. Only God can make a tree, but not a fool like me. So it's dama biyofyo. Dimyon binyan ayofi, chamat lamo kidmut chamat nachash. The venom of the evil is like the venom of a snake. Again, we don't see the evil people with forked tongues, okay, squirting venom. Dimyono ka'aryeh, okay, nichsaf litrof, like a lion. You know, the evil one. It doesn't grow a long, woolly, furry mane, but it's like a lion. Kulam dimyon binyan. We are comparing. Lo bitmul avator. V'chein ne'emar demut hakisei in maaseh merkava. The appearance of the throne doesn't mean, it means it was exalted, like a throne, throne-like. Lo beribu'ova of your varichut raglav. It didn't have huge legs on this chair, or tremendous thickness, 3 miles thick, or it was a square the size of the Empire State Building. Like those poor in intellect tend to think. So when you talk about people in a very funny way, they're pelicans or they're lions or they're snakes, we don't find that in the sub-lunar world. So it must refer to a quality in relation to God. It's not a physical quality. Understanding without any physical means of understanding, no brain, etc. When you begin to think about it, that's the word you use. Okay, there is a demut. Now, if we look at the tshuvot of the Rambam, let's have a look. Shiur Koma, line 33. This was a question asked of the Rambam when he was the great halakhic authority of his age. V'oreinu hadrato, and may the splendid one teach us. Ma ra'ui la'anot mi she'shoel she'ela bidvar Shiur Koma. How about this book, Shiur Koma? What do you think? Ha'im hu sod misodot ha'chachamim zal? Is it a mysterious work? Shebo inyanim atzumim, in which there are amazingly profound ideas, tiviyim, physical or Elohim or metaphysical. Kamo she'amar Rabbeinu Hai zal, like Rabbeinu Hai, the Gaon said, be'echad ha'kuntrusim b'sheilot chagiga, pardes and all that. Uscharo kaful, what's memhe? Min hashamayim. Rambam's reward will be double from heaven for answering our question. Rambam says, Lo chashavti me'olam shu michiburei hachachamim zal. This book wasn't even composed by a Jewish rabbi. V'chalila lahem. And heaven forfend shezeh yeh mehem, but any Jewish rabbi worth his salt to have written a book about God's body. Ve'enu ela chibur echad hadarshanin hayevanim. It's a Greek work, the two law and nothing more. In fact, again, I'll spare you the lecture on the Gnosos. Gnostic theory was a type of theory around the 1st century in Eretz Israel and the whole area. There's something about bits of God being in each and every person. But Rambam says this is a foreign idea. Limchot ze sefer, sof davar, you've got to destroy the book, lichrot zecher inyano, and make sure that nobody ever remembers it. And that is the mitzvah rabbah. V'shem Elohim acherim lo taskiru lo yishamu apicha. It's a pagan work. V'harei mish yesh lo koma hu Elohim acherim b'li safek. The only God who can have a body or a height. And by the way, the height is measured in miles, and the body is like this tremendously wonderful, I don't know, body, but it's all, of course, you could say it's all meant to be a mystical idea. But Rambam says, an idolatrous work, get rid of it. V'chatav Moshe, that's how we would sign his Tuvot, and Moshe wrote. But now let's go on to line 39, the next, another chapter. I've gone from 1 to 57. Remember the Rambam said I'm going to scatter my ideas about the whole book and you'll have to, Yael, where are you? What phrase did I use? Yael Bart. What do you have to connect? Are you still here?
Yes, I am.
And what phrase did I use? Why did the Rambam scatter his ideas about the book? Because you have to connect a word
Dots.
with 3.
The
Thank
dots.
you. There we are. Okay. Connect the dots. So now we're in 57. B'ta'arim yoter amuk min hakodem. Can we describe God? I'm now going to go into this more deeply. And Jonah, have I said it right? Jonah, have I said it right? Okay.
Jonah.
So this is more profound. It's not simply that you cannot attribute a body to God. You cannot say anything about God that's meaningful. You said this last week, Jonah, right?
Hmm.
Depuis un...
You mean I'm Jean, and I'm not sure that you mean me or
I saw the A. At John Adler.
Jean. Oui.
Jean. Okay. Jean. Formidable. Betarim.
If
Amok. Yadua ki hametziut hu mikre kara lidinsa. Now, here the Rambam takes us into language. If I say that John saw, there's John, and there's an act of seeing. Okay? V'lazehu inyan nosaf al mahut hanimsa. John, or Jean, okay, is separate from, John isn't seeing all the time. Sometimes he closes his eyes, sometimes he's asleep, sometimes he's doing something else, okay? But John and the seeing are two different things. There's a predicate and there's a noun. Anybody whose existence is caused by something else, and we human beings are all brought into existence by our parents, there's a biological process, then we have ourselves, our essences, and what happens to us, what occurs to us. But whoever's existence was not caused by something else, and only God was not caused by anything else. God is the, if you like, essence of all existence. Without him, there is no existence, and his existence was not caused by anything else. We'll get involved in this when we talk about how the world was created and whether the world always existed, and a little about science and religion. God's essence is himself, and his attributes are his essence. You cannot say that God saw, because the seeing is already in God. If I say the word God, I mean seeing and knowing, speaking, and all those words which actually I shouldn't be using at all. God lives, but it's not life. Yodea va'al b'mada. He knows, but it's not via knowledge. V'yachol, he's able. v'lo b'yicholet, not because of ability. V'chacham, he's wise, v'lo b'chokhmah, but not because of wisdom. Aval hakol shav linan echad, en ribui bo kamo sheitpaer. God is totally a unity. There's no difference between himself, his essence, and his attributes. Now, how would we translate Ma Shechar Teva into Greek? Metaphysica, metaphysics. Actually, Shem Tov, Ben Shem Tov, talks about this in his commentary, Shem Tov of the Moreh Nevukhim. He searched Aristotle for such an idea. He only found a very delicate reference, not a very extensive one. Truth is that this idea is developed by Ibn Sina, Avicenna, but Rambam may very well have been a pioneer here. The Rambam may have been the first philosopher of that time who made this point most clearly, that God's essence and his attributes are one and the same thing. There's no complexity in God. לכן כמו שהוא מן השקר עליו מקרה הריבוי, then הוא מן השקר עליו מקרה האחדות. But you can't say that God is a unity either. רצוני לומר, כי אין האחדות אינה נוסף על עצמו. Because to say that God is a unity means that there's God and there's something called a unity. Can you say that, Jean? You can't, because God's essence and God's unity, it's all the same thing. He is a unity, but not because of unity. Now, these are very fine matters that cannot be understood. We use words, and Rambam is critiquing our use of language. Rambam is saying that we do not have the necessary linguistic skills to talk about God. Okay? We can only understand what we say. Now, this is a revolutionary idea. This was one of the profoundest ideas in modern philosophy, is that it's not that we use a word to describe the world. How does it really work? We have a word in our head and we use it to understand the world. It's words that teach us about the world, not the other way around. And that's the importance of language. Of course, that's why feminists say, if we use more feminine form, we'll have a different approach to the world of gender.
In 1984, doing away with
Or in
words,
1984, doing away with words,
so that you wouldn't have the concept.
so that the concept would no longer exist. Even if you might see, it might be there to be seen or understood, but the words, in other words, this is the whole of entire modern structuralism, Jean-Paul Sartre, Beauvoir, I mean, it's everything to do, especially Ludwig, who?
Wittgenstein.
Wittgenstein. Was a very interesting character. Indeed, we'll get to him, but we do not have the words, Yael, and the words lead us astray. The more words you use, the worse it is. Wow, that may be a problem for some of us. Therefore, we can't say God is one, because one implies that there's a unity, and there's something which has the quality of unity. But we do, because we are poor in our language. We have no other way of saying it. Because it's the closest we'll get to the Shema as well, and what that echad means. And then he talks about time and space. God is not in time, God is not in space. So that if we say Ani Rishon v'Ani Acharon in the prophet, what we're saying is this is a very poor way of talking about God. Okay? But we should not be talking about him in any way that imputes to him anything that's not entirely a pure unity, and therefore we can never distinguish between his essence and his attributes. And that means God never changes, and he's always there, and we do not understand anything about him really. The Omnam, line 17 אלו המילות כולם כלשון בני אדם. כן אמרנו אחד עניינו. So what do we mean when we say echad, when speaking like human beings? Because we have to start somewhere. We have to teach our children. Shema Yisrael Hashem Eloheinu Hashem echad. Inyano shehu en dimyon lo. It means there's nothing like him. Lo she'inyan ha'achdut davek latzmo. Not that he is anything like a positive unity. So this is called the via negativa. We can only understand, talk about God in terms of what he is not. Via negativa. So God is one means he is not a complexity. But what that one is, we have no idea. So I'm going to call this a categorical negative. A negative that doesn't say he could be something else. This is we can know nothing and infer nothing about him. All we can say is that he is not something which we identify as something. Okay? So this is in fact the more sophisticated level to the argument against corporeality. Hopefully this is clear. And now I'm going to bring you two things very briefly. One is the Pasuk in Tehillim, said a long time before Wittgenstein. Ein lecha dumia, lecha dumia tihila Elohim b'tzion. What is dumia? Domem, duma?
Silence.
Silence. Silence is your true praise. Say nothing. When you grow up and you understand, you know that words are far too poor. Now, Wittgenstein had a very nice sentence indeed, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. So last line in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. It's worthwhile. I'll tell you a little about Ludwig Wittgenstein because it's fascinating. But he was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, focused on language and on logic. But first of all, let me give this to you what I believe is German. Please correct me, Yael and Jack, if I get this wrong. Wollen man nicht sprechen, kann, dabur muss man schweigen. Does that make sense?
Worüber man nicht
Ich würde
sprechen kann,
bis
darüber
sagen.
muss man schweigen.
Ja,
Bonsoir.
Which is a translation.
darüber muss man schweigen.
But
Okay?
Translation of the English.
Yiddish.
That is German.
Yeah, it's like Yiddish.
It is like Yiddish. Debbie's telling me the German is like Yiddish. I'm saying great Kiddush. We know that, okay? It's medieval German with a lot of Slavic words. Now, it's very striking because Wittgenstein, he was born to one of the richest families in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Brahms and Mahler performed in their home. Born in 1889, he died in 1959. Out of his 4 grandparents, 3 were Jewish, but they all baptized and became Catholics, but they were Jewish. Tremendous amount of money, very, very wealthy. Wittgenstein was educated at home. And because he was educated at home, he wasn't quite up to par. So when they realized they had to send him to school, then in school they found was a Realisch Hochschule in Linz in Austria. And who was educated in Linz? Somebody very bad.
Hitler.
Adolf Hitler. Apparently, Hitler had to stay a year behind because he wasn't very bright. Young Wittgenstein was kicked up a year because he was very bright. And there's a whole book about the fact that something about Wittgenstein shining in school made Hitler feel anti-Semitic. There's a whole book about this. I'm not sure how valid it is. The German is Der Jude aus Linz, Hitler und Wittgenstein. The author is Kimberly Cornish. But there's a fascinating interrelationship here. Wittgenstein's life was amazing. He went from Germany and Austria to Manchester University to study. He was interested in engineering, but he soon switched to philosophy, mathematics, and logic. And then he went to Cambridge. He presented himself without any telephone call in Bertrand Russell's study in Cambridge, just burst in and started to lecture. And Russell was so impressed, he took on this young man and he became a scholar at Cambridge University, belonged to all sorts of societies. He was always somewhat odd. I mean, 3 of his siblings committed suicide, but eventually he set out to solve the problems of philosophy, all the problems. And he said, the problem with philosophy is lack of precision in using words. So he spent a few years in a cottage in Norway, working out a system of logic and language that will solve all the problems of philosophy. And this became the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, which was published actually by Bertrand Russell. He actually went through the book, made sure it was a readable work. And then First World War, and anyhow, Wittgenstein leaves philosophy, becomes a school teacher, becomes a gardener, does all sorts of odd things, but then he comes back to philosophy, changes his ideas as philosophers do. His last book, published after his death, was called Philosophical Investigations, was meant to be the ultimate answer, but it is in words that philosophy finds its ultimate expression, and that is the way philosophy needs to be judged. And accuracy in words is what Maimonides is all about. 49 chapters of Moreh Nevukhim only dealing with words. Are we going to learn all 49 chapters? Certainly not, okay? But I've given you enough. Now I want to say something else before we move on to number 5, which is more to do with us. Remember, that in the beginning of Breshit, Adam and Eve commit a sin, right? What happens as a result of the sin? They're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. But what happens prior to that? How do they know they've sinned? Or actually, why did Eve want to eat the apple? Why? What does it say? What did the snake say to Eve? God knows that if you eat the apple, Vehiyitem Kelohim Yodei Tov Vara. In other words, you'll get a knowledge that you haven't got now. So what happens? Then the apple suddenly becomes, it wasn't an apple, of course, whatever the fruit was, it becomes very attractive. In other words, if you have an idea in your head that you want to do something wrong, then everything about that wrongful object becomes very seductive. Then Eve saw, Tov l'mareh, v'nechmad hu la'inayim, I must eat this, and I must share this with Adam. But the reason was, we're going to get extra knowledge. Rambam says that many years ago, somebody clearly not Jewish asked him, isn't there something strange here? Adam and Eve sin, and what happens? They are rewarded with knowledge. They become like God, knowing good and bad that they didn't have before. Is that the punishment for a sin? To gain a whole dimension that makes you noble, good and bad? And what were they before? Did they not know about good and bad? Did you ask yourself these questions when you read the chapter? Michael?
Not very much.
Oh, okay, fine. Not very much is all we need.
They only knew good. They only knew good. There
No,
was nothing evil in
Ori
their life.
Rambam does not say so. Rambam says they did not have the words good and bad, tov vara, in their vocabulary. They didn't have it in their minds, not in their
Hey,
souls.
it
All
was
they
utopia.
had was emet and sheker. Rambam says that they were like God. God doesn't have any issue with something being good for himself or bad for himself, because good and bad are to do with your physical aspect. God knows truth and falsehood, which is, of course, what the Aristotelian philosopher knows. If you know it's true, you do it. There was never a temptation. If you really knew something was the right thing to do, that's how you fulfilled your humanity. You never fall into a trap. It's when your judgment becomes clouded. Now, here the Rambam says something very important. Veyitem kelohim. You'll be like God, the snake says. How does Onkelos translate God, Elohim? Kerav Ravim, like the great judges who know who have to decide what's good and bad for human beings. It's not God in the essence, it's Rav Ravaya. Okay, like Rav Ravinovdek. Onkelos is Maimonides' guide for removing corporeality. And then Maimonides says, why were Adam and Eve not ashamed of being naked? Because truth and falsehood has no issue with naked or not. It's only when you get into good and bad, and what we call the appetitive, immorality, the abuse of your physical organs, that's when you start feeling shame. But if you never get to that stage, if you're like God, there's no issue of shame, and therefore there's no issue of good and bad. Rambam talks at great length about this, and I haven't deliberately read chapter 2 because it would make all of this too long, and we want to include several subjects in our shiurim. But this is an important part and flows on from Tselem and Demut. Originally, Adam and Chava were B'Tselem Elohim, absolute moral probity, intellectual prowess. They clouded themselves morally and intellectually by eating, by disobeying God, and they lost the true and the false that had guided them before that, and therefore they felt shame. They realized what nakedness was, because the true human being only uses the physical body for the true purpose, which is to fulfill the human purpose of what it is to have sexual organs, which is a perfectly excellent thing. It's only when you think about the abusing of it that it becomes shameful, bad, and then you have to use the terms good and bad. So I'm just tagging this on. But Wittgenstein gives us an entry into understanding that Rambam at the end of the day says silence is golden. Now, the next section, which is 59, is nice and long. And that I'm going to give you in a précis form. Rambam says, okay, so what does this all do for us? He begins, of course, as he always does, because he's an excellent teacher, with something very suggestive. He says, look, I've worked years to realize that I can say nothing about God. Lahavdil elef havdalot, Wittgenstein spent 7 years getting to the conclusion that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. But he does it, of course, in a very sophisticated way. But say I'm a beginner. I'm attending a shiur on Moreh Nevukhim. I learned that the Rambam said you can't really say anything about God in a positive way, the via negativa. I'm in the same position as the philosopher who worked hard, who sat as a hermit in the cottage in Norway and got to this conclusion by intellectual effort. What is the difference? At the end of the day, the Rambam says, very important to have a refined and not a degraded religious sensibility. We talked about this last time. There is a difference. When I get to the celebration of silence, because I understand deeply about the nature of God and the inability we have as human beings to do more than use like very weak expressions so that we can have some idea of what Hashem is, okay? I'm in a better position. Generally, my thinking is better. I'm more sophisticated. I'm not a primitive religio. I'm sophisticated. Even at the end of the day, it might seem on the surface that I'm no better than the beginner, but I've gone through a refining process. I will able to converse intelligently with other people who are intelligent about God and not sound like a hillbilly. And I will also not be led astray by primitive ideas of God that lead me to do primitive things. And now the Rambam, I'm not going to bring all his proofs from Tehillim about Imru bilvavchem al mishkavchem v'dumu sela. But let's have a look at line 42. Line 43. Amru brachot lamed gimel bet. Hahu denachit kamei de Rabbi Chanina amar. One chazan was in Rabbi Chanina's shul and he said, Ha'el agadol agibor v'anora ha'adir v'chazak ha'yirui. What is ha'yirui? The one who should be feared. Ve'azuz, aziz, mighty. Amar le Rabbi Hanina says to his cousin, Simatinu l'kulu shivchei demarach. Have you exhausted all of God's praise? Hashta anant lat kamaita ilmale damrinu Moshe Rabbeinu baraita. Look, had Moshe in the Torah not written Ha'el Hagadol, Ha'el, no, Hagadol Hagibor Vahanora, Asher lo yisafani v'lo yikach shochad, okay, had not been in the Torah, Va'atu anshe knesset hagdola v'takninu b'tfilah, and then anshe knesset hagdola, fix them in the prayer, anan lo yachilnan lemirinhu, we could never say them. Va'ant amat va'azalt kulehai, and you've gone on and on. Mashal amar davar domeh, I'll give you a parable. Lemelech basar vadam, shayulu elef alafim didrei zahav. Tens of thousands of gold ducats the king had. Umatal people start praising him, b'shel kesef, but he's got silver ducats. Halo genai hulo, that is degrading God. He's wealthy in gold, and you're saying he's wealthy in silver. Now Rambam says, look carefully at what's going on here. Rabbi Hanina says, how dare you use words other than the minimum that you have authority to use about God, okay? And we say, Dibra Torah Kalashon B'nei Adam, because we have to start somewhere. So we are allowed to, but only if it's the Torah, and also if it's Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, who put them in our Sidur. And what's the mashal, says the Rambam? Melech basav adam, shayu lo elef alafim didnei zahavu mekalsin oto b'me'adin shu moreh ze mashal, line 13. Al shesh shleimut to'otav yitbarach yoter shleimut me'elu hashleimuyot asher yichusu lo rak hem miminim ve'en ha'inyan ken kemo shebe'anu b'mofet. It's not that God has more. God has a different quality. It's not that God has 10,000 dinars and I say it's 1,000 dinars. Uri, God has gold and we have silver. And do not mix your silver and your gold. So this is the issue then. And now he finishes off with again a pasuk in Kohelet. Ki Elohim b'shamayim v'ata ha'aretz al ken yu devarecha ma'atim. Wittgenstein, few words. God is in the heaven. He's different. He's above us. We cannot really think about him in any meaningful way. We can only use Lashon B'nei Adam and begin our lives with words, because that's the only thing we have. But don't go on and on and on. It sounds ridiculous to those who understand. Now I'm going to say one more word. We have 3 more minutes to go. The last section I've given you is actually from the Zohar. Or it's actually Tishbi and Lachover on the Zohar. But Shlomo Pines thought that the Rambam in the Moreh also included a mystical substratum. The mystical substratum is the Ein Sof. Kabbalah has an idea that Ramah Cordovero works out at length in his Elima Rabbah, that God's essence is Ein Sof, no end, nothing. We cannot say a word. Lacha dumia tihila. To you, praise, silence is praise. What we can talk about are the sfirot. Those things that link us to God. God sends us down some kind of little inspiration, 10 levels of inspiration, 10 sfirot. Eventually, in what they call the sublunar realm, the realm underneath the moon, talk a little about perhaps the cosmology of the time later on, under the moon. That 10th bit, which is called the active intellect, we can connect with, and we can talk about God's attributes. Midot HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm going to give you, next week, all being well, an ethical analysis of Rambam at the end of the Moreh Nevukhim, book 3. Talks us about how we can get close to God really without the medium of language and describing him. Without shaking, quivering, quaving, shouting, screaming. But there is a way that we can ethically become close to God, and that's the way he wants us to come close to him. But the mystic will say Rambam is talking about the Kabbalistic Ein Sof. And just as only the midot are what we can understand, that's what, in fact, we're going to be reading in this week's Parsha, are we not? Right at the end, okay? That what we have in terms of God is v'lalechet bidrachav. That's all we can do. Lalechet bidrachav uledov kabo, but not to talk about him at great length. And to have this sophistication, the Rambam wants us all to have. So if you see, I've underlined derech hashlila, the via negativa. But personality is important. And let me close with this thought. We begin by attributing personality to God. Can't help it. As a child, God is an old man in heaven with a long beard. Perhaps he's got a golden crown. It's okay. It is okay to believe that if you want to, okay? But we have to grow out of that. Now, last week, Val said something about understanding God as a force. Remember, Val?
A
Anyhow,
power, yes, a
how
power.
will you do? So I'm going to ask you a question.
Yes.
What line in Psalms would encourage you to become a religious person? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Or the Lord is my force, I shall not want. Which one do you
Yes.
think has more appeal?
I like the second one because
Has
it's
more appeal to the passion, to the
Yes.
poetry. I imagine God as a shepherd, I have a very warm feeling, correct? Shepherd
Yeah.
looks after his sheep.
Yeah,
But if I called God a force, there's
Yeah.
something very impersonal about that. So let's
No.
begin our lives with a personal God, wait, and then move on. And then if we go with the Rambam, we go beyond the force, we go to, in silence, there is praise of thee. And we're looking out for next week's Shiur on how this translates into the Midot. I'm going to stop the share, which time. We're going to go back to full screen. Would anybody like a question or a comment in the few minutes we have?
I would like to say something on what you just
Loud
mentioned.
and clear, Uri.
On what you mentioned just now in the Star Wars, it says, "May the Force be with you."
Absolutely.
Okay. And the second thing I want to tell you is that you may have made history tonight because this may be the first time that the Rambam was heard on the island of Santorini in Greece.
Enjoy, but beware of tsunamis. You know where
Yeah.
Santorini was when the 10 plagues occurred.
yes.
There was a major earthquake, and many of the Christian Bible commentators in the 18th and early 19th centuries account for the plagues because of the earthquake and the tsunami on Santorini.
Yes,
So
it was.
explore that. Val, you're saying yes.
Yes,
Yes.
it was the Sea of Reeds actually, and it's in the right position to have been affected by the tsunami from the
The
island.
tsunami, there you are. You
Yeah.
never know what a little Santorini will do for your biblical scholarship.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any more? Then I will bid everybody a very good evening, and we will continue next week, and we will begin to segue into Rambam's concept of nevuah or prophecy, which is also very interesting and highly original, and moves us on to understanding divine providence and then creation and a lot of other things. We'll see how far we get. A very
Thanks,
good
Danny.
evening to
Thank you.
one and all.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much.
Bruchim to you. Bye.
Thank you very
Good
much.
night.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Shiur.